Voters in both Oregon and Colorado Tuesday opted against ballot initiatives that would have required GMO labeling on food. The measure failed by a wide margin in Colorado, but the spread in Oregon was so narrow it was too close to call the following morning. In only the last few years, voters have rejected similar measures in both California and Washington. Earlier this year, Vermont passed labeling laws, as did Connecticut and Maine previously. But all three were done through state legislatures, and Connecticut and Maine laws only enact if other states do the same. In addition to its incredibly tight margin, the ballot measure in Oregon was also extremely costly. The Associated Press says that campaign was the most expensive ballot measure in state history, with about $20 million in opposition and $7.5 million in favor. Jayson Lusk studies consumer behavior in foods for Oklahoma State as a Regents professor and Willard Sparks Endowed Chair in the university's Department of Agricultural Economics. We talked with Jayson Thursday morning and began by asking if he was surprised at the results in Colorado and Oregon.
I think especially in Oregon, it was really too close to call, so I think it would have been hard to be surprised either way. But in both of those races, as has been the case when there have been other mandatory labeling initiatives in other states, these initiatives have started out polling very favorably. Most look like they're going to pass with wide margins, and now in 4 cases ultimately have failed. So in that case, it is a little surprising in terms of the extent to which people's minds can be changed on the issue.
That means then that they're willing to listen to the debate or at least the advertisements?
Right. Well, there is a lot of advertising spent, and indeed I think in the case of Oregon, I believe that this was one of the most expensive ballot initiatives that the state has ever had in terms of advertising. So yeah, there's a lot of messaging that's going on out there, but ultimately there are people sitting at home listening to those messages, and apparently some of them must have changed their mind.
Is there an argument to be made that the pro-labeling crowd merely lacks the cash to make this a little bit of a fair fight?
I think someone could make that argument. The folks that are fighting against the mandatory labels have spent more, and they do have more money at their disposal. So that is part of the story. But I think ultimately that if you look at the science and the arguments against the labels, that really I think it is a more compelling argument. And in surveys that we've done where we show people advertisements, some people see the pro advertisements, some see the negative advertisements, that the advertisements against the mandatory label are more persuasive with people. So this is not who has more money, but just comparing ads to ads, and it looks like the sort of negative ads are often more persuasive.
Right, and to the flip side of that previous question would be, how many of these people that are in opposition would be anti-GMO, and how many would just be anti-big company like Monsanto?
Yeah, it's a consortium of people, as it is on any sort of issue. And I think there's a little bit of a dichotomy too. I think one of the main arguments people use in favor of the labeling is that consumers just have a right to know. It's a little hard to know how far those rights should extend, and whether we're willing, what we're willing to pay for those rights, and how those rights should be balanced against, farmers' rights to not disclose information. But all that being said, I think that in that movement there are at least some people that are rabidly anti-GMO and use, quite frankly, all sorts of questionable science to make scary claims about the technology, which the best scientific literature really doesn't support. That's not true necessarily of everyone that promotes that label, but that is true of a segment.
We've now seen initiatives fail in California, Oregon, Washington, and Colorado. Does it look increasingly like state legislatures are going to be the route for passing any sort of labeling laws?
Well, I hate to predict the future, but that probably does seem to be the case. We've seen in Vermont is the only state right now that has passed a mandatory labeling law, and it was done so through the state legislature. We've got a couple of other states in the Northeast which have done something similar, although their laws were somewhat interesting in that they have contingency clauses. They don't go into effect until a certain number of other states go into effect. And that does point to this issue that the labels could be costly, and these states don't want to be sitting out there as the only ones that are incurring this higher cost for themselves. So yeah, there seems to have been more success in terms of state legislatures than there have been in terms of just public voting ballot initiatives.
Do you think cost of labeling is a realistic argument here?
I think it's hard to know exactly what the economic consequences can be. So on the one hand, people that advocate on behalf of the label say, well, food companies change their labels all the time. This is really not that costly, just to add a few words to it. And in one sense, they're right about that. On the other side, I think other folks would argue that, well, you gotta look at the unintended consequences, or maybe the intended consequences, depending on which side of which perspective you have. And that is, how will food companies respond to this label? And I think a lot of food companies don't want to put a label that says may contains genetically engineered food. They're fearful that they'll lose customers if they do that some people may interpret it as a sort of skull and crossbones. And if that's their feeling, and let's say one of their competitors adopts a policy, says we're not going to label anything with GMOs, and they start losing some market share to those companies, they may start to try to source non-GMO products or organic products, and that could really drive up the cost. And that's the sort of concern I think that some people have about the label, that it's that kind of cost that could really increase food prices. But I think an honest observer would have to say we don't really know what the outcome could be, and it could be somewhere in between those two.
I was reading one thing you said to close out here is that you're not necessarily concerned about the cost, but you're concerned that this could lead to less agricultural innovation. Can you explain what you mean?
Yeah, I think we get sort of tied up a lot talking about the immediate cost of the label. Will it cost the average U.S. household mere pennies each year or thousands of dollars each year? I mean, those are real costs, and that's an important debate to have. But I think the broader issue is a longer term issue. And that is, if we adopt an environment that is hostile to innovation in food and agriculture, those could have significant long-term costs and consequences. For example, another ballot initiative that we had on Tuesday was in Hawaii and Maui, and they actually voted to ban the production, or at least put a moratorium on the production of GMOs in Hawaii. You might say, well, who cares about Hawaii? That's not a big piece of the puzzle, but a lot of the biotech companies have research and development facilities there because they can grow crops year-round and do all kinds of research. And it's those kinds of policies that really hinder research, that make research more expensive, that limit the potential technologies that we can expect to see in the future. And so it's the foregone opportunities that we may witness that really may entail the bigger costs.
You can find more from Jayson on GMO labeling and consumer behavior on his blog. We'll link to that on the Market Journal homepage.